When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, we travel to Edinburgh to look at the fascinating story behind one of Scotland's longest-running investigations, the World's End murders.
They just had the terrible misfortune to cross paths with two evil, dangerous men.
And we go to Scamden Moor near Huddersfield to look at the science behind finding the killer of Christopher Pratt.
I like to think that the forensic entomology is providing one bit of the jigsaw evidence, and it might often be the missing one that finally solves the picture. Aberdeen, 2013. Lorna Dawson has been asked to help solve one of the UK's longest-running cold cases, the World's End murders. Lorna remembers the crime only too well.
I got a phone call from Lothian Borders Police, and they said, we've got a cold case here, and there's some soil samples that were taken from one of the victims in the World's End murders. Would you be able to look at it? I said, yes, we'll have a look at them. And I thought, goodness me, that's the case that was in Edinburgh when I was a student.
Edinburgh, 1977, a city famous for its nightlife, when suddenly two 17-year-old friends, Helen Scott and Christine Eady, were discovered murdered after a night out at the city's famous World's End pub.
I had just moved to Edinburgh as a student studying geography and geology, and it shocked us all. There was a real fear, particularly amongst my peer group, who were the same age and stage as poor Helen and Christine.
For Detective Tom Wood, the World's End case remains one of the most important of his career.
On the 15th of October 1977, Saturday, two young girls went out for a night out in Edinburgh and ended up in the World's End pub in the High Street. It's noticed that there's a couple of men join the company, and these are strangers, and they're seen speaking to Helen and Christine. At 10 o'clock, the pub's closed, and everybody leaves. So they're seen leaving, going down St Mary's Street in the company of these two men.
That was the last witness sighting of the two young women. Helen's brother, Kevin, was 11 years old. He remembers growing panic at home as the hours passed with no word from his sister.
I remember waking up and there was still a light on in the house, so I got up and my mother was sitting downstairs, wondering why Helen didn't come home. Come the next morning, obviously, there was a lot of concern. You just knew it wasn't right.
The following day, Helen and Christine's families received the news they were dreading. Their daughters' bodies had been found. First was Christine's.
A dog walker had been walking along the tide line of the beach and saw what he thought was a tailor's dummy lying on the coast. As they approached, they got closer, they realised it wasn't a tailor's dummy, it was actually the body of Christine. Just as the first tranche of detectives were coming on the scene, we got a call to say that a farmer had found the body of another girl about 5 or 6 miles away, and this was Helen.
Helen's body was found tied up, lying on top of her coat in the middle of a field.
We came from an environment where nobody locked their doors, so we were a trusting family. Helen was a trusting girl. The household was just distraught. I mean, it blows a family apart.
Police quickly secured the crime scene and began an extensive search of the area where Helen's body was found.
We were lucky in that the first response from our crime laboratory, our forensic laboratory, were scientists who were practiced in crime scene management. That morning on the 16th of October, a young South African scientist called Lester Nib, he attended at the scene, and so he took possession of the coat, he took possessions of the gaggings and the bindings.
But Lester Nib went even further. He recovered forensic evidence for which police did not yet have the science to crack, including soil samples from the body and the crime scene.
He secured these samples in a proper way and made sure that not only were they preserved properly, but that there was a clear record of everywhere they had been. And this is absolutely critical.
In 1977, forensic science was still in its infancy. It would be decades before these samples could be effectively analysed.
You know that something very important is here. You just don't have the means or the wit or the science to interpret it. So what you must do is you must retain it carefully, and you must monitor the developments of a forensic science until such times it gives up its secrets.
One piece of evidence frustrated detectives more than any other.
That's Helen's coat, and this is the lining, which was so absolutely crucial. There was a large stain, which we always presumed was the murderer.
But in 1977, there was no way for science to identify who that person was.
It was very difficult for the police to work out in those times what happened. And of course, then there was no DNA technology. So it was very difficult, even although they had samples. There was none of these new methods that are now available that could help the investigation of that crime.
For nearly 30 years, the investigation made little progress, and Helen and Christine's killer remained on the loose. Then, in 2003, advances in DNA analysis gave police the breakthrough they had been waiting for.
What they did was they looked at the stain, and if you think about that stain on Helen's coat, it's a bit like DNA soup, right? And what they managed to do was they managed to pick the individual elements out of this soup and actually create not one, but 2 male profiles and a female profile. The female profile obviously was Helen, it's her coat, the one male profile, and it was not on any database whatsoever. But the second male profile, we checked that against the database, and that came up as Angus Robertson Sinclair.
Angus Sinclair was a convicted murderer, already in prison for killing another young woman. It turned out the second DNA profile belonged to his brother-in-law, Gordon Hamilton. Hamilton had died in 1996. But with compelling new DNA evidence, Angus Sinclair could now be prosecuted for the murder of Helen Scott and Christine Eady. Nothing was certain, however, and Tom was worried he needed even more to guarantee a conviction.
Now, we had built up a very compelling circumstantial case surrounding that strong case of DNA, because we always suspected that what Angus Sinclair would say was, yes, I may have met them and we had consensual sex, but I didn't kill them.
Sure enough, in court, Sinclair's defense team did precisely that. Sinclair claimed the women were alive when he left them, and he denied their murder. Without more supporting evidence, he was acquitted.
I remember speaking to someone and they said, well, that's it. I remember these words, "That's it, there's nothing you can do." And I remember walking away from that thinking, somebody can do something.
It would take another 7 years of scientific progress, but that somebody would prove to be soil expert Lorna Dawson.
In the intervening period between the first trial and 2013, we had been developing methodology to look at the organic profile in soil. So soils vary across a landscape, but they also vary with depth. Because soil can be georeferenced, the inorganic part can tell us about what the underlying geology is, and that is mapped, so we know where it has come from. Soil helps us answer the where question.
They tried to convict Angus Sinclair in 2007 using DNA evidence alone. It wasn't enough. Now the investigation team turned to samples of soil gathered by Lester Knibb in the original investigation.
Think about building this picture. So you've not only got the strong central feature of the DNA, but you also have the background to the picture. And the background to the picture is how Helen Scott got to that place. You know, was she carried? Was she dumped? Did she walk?
In 2007, Angus Sinclair's defence team claimed Helen was still alive when he left her. They insisted someone else must have killed her. Now, brand new soil analysis techniques could prove otherwise.
So these are the traces. This is one of the aggregates from Helen Scott's feet, LD4. This is another one. Now you can see that they have different profiles.
Lorna compared these samples from Helen's feet with samples taken from around the crime scene.
This question sample from Helen's feet likely came from this grass verge, while this LD5 aggregate, which also came from her feet, shares the characteristics of this profile, which was that of the wheat field where she was found.
Lorna was beginning to piece together Helen's final moments.
So this led to the conclusion that she had likely stood or walked not only in the wheat field, but also at the grass verge, leading the prosecutors to conclude that she had indeed been alive at that time and likely walked to her death.
This discovery would prove a major breakthrough, especially when combined with new evidence from the tights used to bind Helen.
Between 2007 and 2013, DNA evidence had come on. We could tell a lot more from the knots and bindings. When we undid the bindings, we found low copy samples of Angus Sinclair's DNA, and we could show through expert witnesses that these knots had not only been tied by him, but they had been tied tightly by him.
Lorna's soil evidence proved Helen had walked to where she had been killed. Meanwhile, the DNA from the bindings put Sinclair with her body.
We needed evidence from experts like Lorna so as to support the DNA case. It was very important to build up that sequence of events. We could then show that she had not wandered off, that she had been walked into the field to be killed. All building up that compelling picture which Angus Sinclair could not wriggle out of.
The team now had enough to start a brand new prosecution. The trial was scheduled for 2014.
As the date drew for the start of the new trial, you're always going to have a concern that you're not going to get the result, the desired result, that's going to bring justice.
Everything was hanging on the new evidence. Lorna had just one chance to explain to the jury what she had found.
An expert witness must not only be an expert in their field, recognised as such, but must be able to interpret their expertise and explain that to a jury. That's critical.
I remember giving evidence in this particular case. I think people don't realise the amount of work that goes into an examination, an analysis, evaluation, and interpreting that and then presenting it in court.
Lorna's evidence not only helped contradict Sinclair's account of what happened, for the jury, it also offered a compelling account of Helen Scott's final moments.
You're describing a scene and you're painting a picture for a jury. The jury have got to get their heads round a whole three-dimensional picture of what exactly took place here. So the fact that Lorna Dawson could say, this poor girl who was murdered in this field was actually walked in was hugely compelling.
Angus Sinclair was found guilty and sentenced to 37 years, symbolic of the time it had taken to reach a conviction.
We have waited 37 years for justice. Today, that wait has ended. We finally have justice for Helen and Christine.
Angus Sinclair was one of the most evil, dangerous men to walk the face of the UK in the 20th century. I've got no doubts about saying that.
What I would say to the expert witnesses is thank you for everything you've done. The story of what happened to Helen and Christine, there was no witness that saw the crime. There was nobody that could point a finger.
Two bright young girls at the very start of their lives, what might they have achieved? What family might they have had? All of that's lost, and that's the bit that you start to think about.
The number one question that police ask me is, how long has this body been dead? Forensic entomology is providing one bit of the jigsaw evidence, and it might often be the missing one that finally solves the picture.
Scamenden Moor near Huddersfield, 2009. The body of a 51-year-old man has been found by a jogger. Police are called to the scene, and journalist Nick Britton is assigned to cover the case.
Christopher Pratt's body was found after he went missing, lying naked in wasteland near Scamenden.
Christopher Pratt was a civil servant and father of two from Grantham in Lincolnshire. His body had been on the moor for some time. Why he had been left there was a mystery. To solve it, forensic investigators needed to act as quickly as possible, as retired detective Roy Lambert explains.
You only get one chance of examining a scene. If you don't get it right first time, it's called a golden hour, but that's not a golden hour. It can last for days or weeks. It's about getting the examination of the scene, of the victim, right first time.
For detectives, there was one question that needed to be answered as soon as possible.
Where bodies are found and have been in place for quite a while, it's important to try and find an approximate time of death. Now, there's various means that can be done with that. One of the things is using insects. In the case of the murder of Mr. Pratt, that then helped the investigators piece together his movements, which ultimately led to the offender.
Martin Hall is an entomologist, an expert in insects. Once based at the Natural History Museum, he's now frequently called on as an expert witness to determine time of death in numerous murder investigations.
I've been working as an expert witness in the field of forensic entomology for about 30 years now. Establishing time of death is really important. It sets the whole timescale for the investigation. I like to think that the forensic entomology is providing one bit of the jigsaw evidence, and it might often be the missing one that finally solves the picture.
Martin's ability to determine time of death is all down to the life cycle of blowflies. When a body is left in the open air, they're quickly attracted to it and lay eggs. Larvae hatch from these eggs, and it's their rate of development that provides Martin with vital clues.
The life cycles of all blowflies are very similar, so egg to larva to puparia to adult fly, but the rates of development can vary. So it's very important to get the identification correct if you want to get the timing right.
Martin began an analysis of the insects found on Chris Pratt's body. Just as important as their species was the temperature around the body. This affects how quickly the larvae grow.
Blowflies grow almost exponentially, really rapidly, and so even subtle differences in temperature are important. The difference between these is 27 degrees and these ones just 21 degrees, only 6 degrees, but they're much, much bigger in the jar here. If you don't take into account temperature, then there's no way you can tell how old the insects are. In a way, unlike us, they don't just age in days, they age proportional to heat as well. So there's no way at all of telling how old these maggots are by just looking at them. What you need to do is take into account the temperature data. Without that, there's no way that you can provide an accurate estimate of their age.
Scamandon Moor has a microclimate very different to the surrounding area. In order to prove how long Christopher Pratt had been lying there, Martin needed to work out the temperatures at the scene where the body was discovered.
Not surprisingly, there wasn't a convenient weather station right by the body, and so what we needed to do was try to get estimates of what the actual scene temperatures were. So a data logger was placed there by the scenes of crime officers. So this is a typical data logger. They record temperature and relative humidity. Basically, they enable you to put the temperature recording device at the scene where the body was found, and you can record for ideally something like 10 days after the body was removed, and then you can relate the temperatures from the data logger to those at a nearby weather station for the same period. What this allowed us to do is then actually work out what temperatures the insects were experiencing and how fast they would develop.
While Martin continued his analysis, the police investigation also made progress. They discovered that Christopher Pratt had been seen with a man called Desmond Lee.
Desmond Lee's a very dangerous man, and by the time he met Christopher Pratt, he'd already served one life sentence for murder. Having murdered his landlady, he'd been let out. After serving 14 years, he'd been let out on what's called a life licence. He met Christopher Pratt in a gay sauna in Dewsbury. They became good friends. They struck up a sexual relationship.
Desmond Lee immediately became a person of interest to the investigation, but key to deciding whether he could in fact be the killer was knowing when Chris Pratt had died. Entomologist Martin Hall had the answer.
We now had a knowledge of the temperatures at the scene. We had our knowledge that the biggest maggots were around about 11 millimetres long. From the laboratory studies, although they were somewhat limited, we had a pretty good idea of how long it would take for those larvae to develop to that size at the temperatures that we found at the scene. And so we were able to determine when those eggs were first laid on the body.
Martin's evidence showed Christopher Pratt's body lay on the moor for over 6 days until it was discovered. At last, detectives had a likely time of death. They now looked for CCTV from around this time. When they found footage of Chris entering Desmond Lee's flat, they brought Lee in for questioning.
Once, if you're lucky, you've established a time frame of when a person may have died. As an investigator, you can then use that when you're going questioning witnesses and suspects to find out where they were during that period, to establish either an alibi or they haven't got an alibi.
Desmond Lee had no alibi. Under questioning, he admitted Christopher had died in his flat, but claimed it was an accident.
His neck was broken, his voice box was crushed during an extremely violent act.
Lee claimed he put Chris's remains on the moors out of panic. Yet detectives could show that before he even moved the body, Lee had sufficient nerve to use Chris Pratt's credit cards for a personal spending spree.
He paid off his mobile phone bill that night. The next day, bought a load of goods from a supermarket. He then went back to the flat, bundled Christopher's body into his car and drove it to wasteland and just dumped it. The callousness to do that is truly extraordinary.
April 2010, at Leeds Crown Court, Desmond Lee stood trial for the murder of Christopher Pratt.
During the trial, the weight of evidence stacked up and stacked up against Desmond Lee. Of course, we had CCTV footage of Christopher Pratt entering Desmond's flat. We have the forensic entomologist saying that he had been in the field for pretty much the entire time since he was last seen. We have Desmond Lee's history. He's a convicted killer. And all of these things added up and led to the jury convicting unanimously Desmond Lee of Christopher Pratt's murder.
The judge sentenced Desmond Lee to life imprisonment.
In this case, like in all cases where we're able to help the police investigation convict a killer, it's very satisfying to know that that person will hopefully not be able to commit any further crimes. And of course it helps the family gain some sort of closure. My working in forensic entomology is an area of science that I never in my wildest dreams ever expected to get into, and it's shown me aspects of human nature that I'm just astonished how callous some people can be.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. In this programme, we reveal how brand new forensic evidence uncovered by an expert witness helped catch a killer and resolve a notorious miscarriage of justice.
I'm definitely angry. I've always been angry since. They say, oh, don't be angry, let it go. Well, you let it go. Go and sit in the cell for 2 years, take you away from your family.
And we discover how forensic analysis of fragments of CCTV footage blew apart a suspect's alibi and identified him as a killer.
When you looked closely, it almost looked as though he had a limp. He had such an unusual gait.
This is the story of how DNA finally caught the killer of Lynette White.
The Lynette White case demonstrated the real importance of the new approaches we were bringing to cold case work. And the other thing it did was finally sort out once and for all who was guilty of Lynette's murder.
Town, Cardiff, 1988. Lynette White was just 20 years old when she was found stabbed to death in this flat above a bookmaker's. John Williams is a writer and journalist who covered the case and its consequences.
Lynette White was a sex worker from Cardiff. She's a girl who'd had a very troubled childhood. She was found in a room that belonged to a friend of hers. She'd been stabbed something like 58 times.
John Actie was 26 years old at the time and living in this part of Cardiff. He knew Lynette a little, just enough to say hello.
This is James Street. This is where the young lady was killed. The first I heard about Lynette White's death was on the Monday morning, the 15th, the day before my daughter's birth. And then I got the paper, I went, oh my God, I know this girl from walking around the streets, you know? It's the first time I've stood out here. She was a young lady, you know, and it's just sad that she went through such a brutal murder.
In December 1988, after a 9-month investigation, the police arrested 5 men for Lynette's murder. John Actie was one of them.
The police knocked my door and asked me if I could accompany them to the police station. You've been dragged from your house, taken to a police cell, 4 days questioning. Then he took me back to another police station and then he charged me. And I didn't come out of jail for the next 2 years. You know, they put me in jail for a crime I never committed.
All 5 men protested their innocence, and there was no forensic evidence to link them to the crime. But they would be held in custody for 2 years awaiting the trial. The prosecution case rested on witness statements that have since been discredited and a confession from one of the men which implicated all 5 of them.
The real key piece of evidence was the confession of Stephen Miller, who was Lynette White's boyfriend. Stephen Miller was a vulnerable young man. He was assessed as having, low IQ. Not only did they badger him, but they also led him on. They provided him with evidence, and after hours and hours of questioning, he had confessed to killing her.
They was feeding him a story, saying, you went in there with him, he done this, he was done that. Remember, he had 20 interviews. Oh, you know how many hours that is? That's torture.
At trial, John Actie and 1 other defendant were cleared by the jury. But Stephen Miller and 2 others were convicted and sentenced to life. They became known as the Cardiff Three. With public support, their families campaigned to prove their innocence. Finally, in December 1992, Miller's confession was deemed inadmissible and they were freed. But the mystery of who killed Lynette White remained unanswered, leaving a killer at large.
They walk in the streets!
Lynette's family searching for justice and a stubborn shadow over the innocence of all the men involved.
I was living under a shadow of suspicion. Yeah, I've been called the murderer a few times. Being accused of killing a young girl, stabbing her 50 to 70 times. How could you live with yourself to think about doing something like that?
In 1999, a cold case unit was set up to reinvestigate the case and find the real killer. Detectives hoped advances in forensic science could now reveal new evidence. And they turned to expert witness Angela Gallup.
One of the things we decided to do as part of our strategy was to have a look at everything that had been seized that hadn't been looked at before, however insignificant. And so we were looking at things like bits of biscuit wrappers and the cellophane that went round a cigarette packet.
The innocuous piece of cellophane revealed an intriguing item of evidence, a blood droplet formed in a very distinctive shape.
That was really important because that indicated that it had been airborne, so a tiny droplet of blood had landed on the cellophane, and that meant that it could have come from the offender.
Angela now used modern DNA analysis to begin to identify which individual this blood had come from.
It was a male profile, and that was the beginning of the unlocking of that case, and we called him Cellophane Man, because you have to refer to these things some way, and he became massive in the investigation.
Cellophane Man's blood did not match any other samples originally recovered from the crime scene in 1988, and one speck was not enough to prove he killed Lynette White. But crime scene photographs showed distinctive blood staining on one area of skirting board.
We'd noticed there was some sort of blood splashing very close to Lynette's body, of the right kind of the right type to have been shed from someone who was bleeding and wielding a weapon.
Angela believed this was the killer's blood. The question was, would any still be there over 10 years later?
I visited the murder flat 3 or 4 years after the actual murder, and there was blood stains all over the walls. Someone had put one thin coat of white paint over it, but you could still see the blood stains. It was absolutely, absolutely horrifying.
It had been over a decade since Lynette White was murdered. Now, Angela hoped to find the killer's blood still at the crime scene and to use it to finally unlock the real murderer's identity.
The whole flat had been painted twice in the intervening years, and we scraped very carefully away at the relevant section of skirting board to try and reveal the blood under a low-power microscope with a scalpel. We recognised how risky this was because it would only be sort of relatively small amounts of blood, we thought, underneath the paint. And we didn't know exactly what depth it was. So we had to go really, really carefully so that we didn't go too shallow and never reveal it, and we didn't go too deep and lose it all.
This painstaking work took 2 weeks, but finally Angela's team found what they were looking for.
We were able to discover some blood under the paint, and that also turned out to be the same DNA profile as Cellophane Man. And that meant that the person it came from must have had something to do with the murder.
Analysis of the blood revealed the full DNA profile, but when it was compared to the police DNA database, they could find no match, so detectives stepped up their investigation.
The police then did a mass screening of local people. They collected samples from them and we tested them against Cellophane Man, but they didn't get anywhere with that.
It seemed the identity of Lynette's murderer was going to remain a mystery.
I think so long after the murder, people were starting to wonder whether, they would ever find the killer, or whether one would just have to accept that it was just some random guy who'd got away with it.
But Angela and her team refused to give up.
We decided not to abandon the database, but to go back and see if we could find some family member, so someone whose DNA matched quite a lot of Cellophane Man's DNA, but obviously wasn't. So we started off looking at the rarest component of Cellophane Man's profile. It occurred in about 1 in 100 of the population.
This comparison identified 70 possible matches, and further DNA analysis reduced that to just one person. But there was a problem. The DNA match was with a juvenile.
The young man in question was a toddler at the time of the murder, so he clearly wasn't the murderer. But what they realised was that they could have a look at the family of this guy.
We looked at the father. It wasn't him, he was very close though, so we felt we were completely on the right track. Then we looked at the father's brother, and it wasn't him, but he was very close. And then the police discovered that there was another brother. They got a sample from him, and we profiled that. And that turned out to be the match, and that was Jeffrey Gaffor.
Jeffrey Gaffor was now 37 and working as a security guard. In 1988, when Lynette White was murdered, he was living and working in his family's shop in Cardiff.
He was the original quiet loner, and yeah, it appears to be more or less his only serious offence that anyone knows of was this murder.
The cold case team arrested Jeffrey Gaffor. When questioned, he broke down and confessed to the murder of Lynette White 15 years earlier.
By his account, he had asked her for sex, he'd gone back to the flat, and then he changed his mind, and she wouldn't give him his money back, and he lost his temper, and then he stabbed her to death.
In court, Gaffor pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life. Angela's evidence made forensic science history. It was the first time that this kind of familial DNA profiling had been successfully used in a cold case to bring a murderer to trial.
This was the first time that it was used and someone was still alive and they could be charged, and they were ultimately convicted.
The case also made history in another way. Gaffor's conviction meant the 5 men wrongfully arrested in 1988 were at last completely exonerated.
This was the first time in a miscarriage of justice case that the actual murderer had been convicted of the murder. It's only once Jeffrey Gaffor was convicted that these guys were able to, walk the streets without, a cloud of suspicion following them.
I'm definitely angry. I've always been angry since. They say, oh, don't be angry, let it go. Well, you let it go. Go and sit in the cell for 2 years, take it away from your family.
It is a case that I'm very proud of, and proud of the scientists that worked with me. It showed how powerful DNA profiling had become. But on another level, and over above all of that, it finally gave closure to Lynette's family, because they were finally looking at the person who had killed their daughter or their relative.
If you're being mugged in Lewisham, how are you on camera a stone's throw from the murder scene?
The way every person walks or runs is actually unique. In forensic gait analysis, you're trying to detect small differences in how a part of the body is moving.
January 2007, Vauxhall, London. It's a Saturday. New Zealander Kathy Marlowe has gone to her office to catch up on some work. She then plans to meet friends for lunch, but never turned up. Later that day, her body was discovered at her office. She'd been strangled. Detective Damien Allen was put in charge of the investigation.
We had marks that led from the attack site to a communal shower room, and Kathy's body was found in the shower cubicle.
Kathy's hometown was Hawke's Bay in New Zealand, where her sister Debbie was about to receive the terrible news.
2:28 a.m. and our doorbell rang, and the police don't call at that time for nothing. So, they asked me to get up and come down into the lounge, and they just said that there'd been an incident at Catherine's workplace, and I think it took them a while actually to tell us that she'd passed.
Kathy Marlowe was just 28 years old when she was killed. She had been away from home for 3 years.
She was vivacious, a much loved sibling and a daughter. There's only so much you can do in small town New Zealand, so she was quite keen to get out there and experience the world, really. And you expect them to come back in one piece. And my brother and I did it, and so why shouldn't she?
Cathy's colleagues have paid tribute to her, describing her as a bright, much-loved and highly regarded young woman.
Senior Investigating Officer Damien and his team began with a fingertip forensic search of the offices and surrounding area. The circumstances of the attack remained a mystery.
It may be a colleague, it may be a stranger, we don't know. So I remain open-minded, hence the importance of the forensic work we're doing. There were no witnesses. We had a complicated forensic scene. There was no CCTV inside the venue, but there were cameras dotted about, in the locality.
Police had hundreds of hours of CCTV to scroll through, but after weeks of false leads, they had still not identified any firm suspects.
It's a popular misconception by the public that CCTV is the panacea when it comes to investigations, but the reality is somewhat different. It was a busy urban area. You've got lots of cameras, varying quality. Does it depict, to a good enough standard, the facial imagery? And the answer to that question is quite often no.
Weeks went by, and with increasing media scrutiny, the pressure was on Damien's investigation. After 4 weeks, he and the team had made slow progress, and then a big leap forward.
I had a call from the Forensic Science Laboratory to say, we've identified one male DNA profile from 2 separate fingernails, which was, a real breakthrough for us.
The profile matched 31-year-old Matthew Fagan, a web production manager who had moved to the UK from America in 2001. He was on the police database because of a minor offence for drunkenness. He also had a connection to where Cathy worked.
So we had a hit, and we now had a potential suspect. And what we established was that Fagan had worked for that company, the same company Cathy had worked for, and really he was an underperforming employee that ultimately resulted in him being sacked 6 months previously.
Fagan's DNA was found on Cathy's fingernails, but because they had shared an office, it wasn't conclusive proof he had attacked her. But Damien did now have his first possible suspect, and when detectives returned to the CCTV, they found another crucial clue.
So here's the CCTV camera that picks up Fagan heading towards the scene. But that was a shot through this iron gate. So we've got Fagan at about 13:02, 13:03, moving towards the office block where Cathy worked. So this is in advance of the murder.
2 hours later, Fagan can be seen again.
This street was quite important because this is where Fagan was captured twice on CCTV. Just after 3 o'clock, walking away from 66 South Lambeth Road. This is at 15:03, and this is after the murder's taken place. And it looks as though he's carrying something at this point.
Fagan was brought in for questioning, but insisted the person seen on camera was not him. He even gave an alibi. Fagan claimed he was 5 miles away in Lewisham, that he had been mugged, injured his head, and had then gone to hospital to have his injuries looked at. Damien wasn't convinced.
We found no evidence that he had been in Lewisham at that time, and no evidence of any journey there, whether by walking, public transport or vehicle.
The hospital confirmed Fagan did have a head injury, and he could be seen on their CCTV checking in at reception. But Damien believed he was injured not in Lewisham, but 5 miles away in Vauxhall around the time Cathy was attacked. Now, he needed to prove it. The problem was the CCTV footage was nowhere near clear enough to do that in a court of law. But Damien had another idea.
And part of the role of being a senior investigating officer is understanding what is available out there in terms of forensic experts. What tools in the box could you employ to help you improve the case that you put before the jury? And when you looked closely at how Fagan walked, it almost looked as though he had a limp. He had such an unusual gait.
Damien turned to an area of forensic science known as gait analysis.
So this is the setup from our Gait laboratory.
Dr. Julie Stebbins of Oxford University is an expert in the field and runs a laboratory that analyses how people walk.
Most people fall within a fairly narrow band of how you walk. So the way we analyse people is to compare their walking patterns to a reference band. So we're looking for where they fall outside of that band.
Gait analysis allowed a comparison between footage Fagan agreed was him at hospital and the footage Damien believed was him near the crime scene.
So I would first of all look at overall how the person's moving, if there's anything about the smoothness of their walk, the symmetry of their limbs. So if you're looking at the knee from the side, I would expect the knee to be fully extended when the foot first hits the ground, then to be a slight degree of flexion, then back to fully extended as the body comes over the leg, and then the knee flexes in order to be able to swing the leg through.
Fagan's gait in this footage was then compared to the man seen in the CCTV from near the crime scene.
So if I'm trying to determine the angle at the knee, I need to be able to see the line of the upper leg and the line of the lower leg. So it would take quite a long time to examine this footage, to go through it in the amount of detail that you need to be able to identify each feature. So you would look at this over and over and over again. Forensic gait analysis, it's not that you're directed towards one feature. You have the whole person and you're trying to say, is there something about how this whole person walks that's identifiable in two pieces of footage? It looks like he has a bit of trunk sway to the left and possibly one of his feet pointing more than the other.
The analysis confirmed in Matthew Fagan's gait, as seen in the hospital footage, was the same as the man seen walking near the crime scene. And that this gait was distinctive enough to prove it was the same man.
It went to the heart of what Fagan was suggesting, that he was being mugged in Lewisham. Well, if you're being mugged in Lewisham, how are you on camera a stone's throw from the murder scene?
Damien confronted Fagan with the new evidence. He immediately changed his story. Fagan now claimed he was part of a gang who went to burgle the offices, but fled when Kathy recognised him.
He said, I went there with others. Kathy disturbed us. They began to tie her up, and at that point, I decided to leave. So in other words, I had no involvement in this at all.
For the first time, Damien had proof Fagan was at the scene of Kathy's murder, and forensic analysis now revealed further evidence of Fagan's involvement.
So we found a hair on a fleck of flesh on the wall where the attack had taken place. We found his blood, DNA and blood underneath the desks where he'd gone to steal the laptops. So there was physical evidence of his involvement at the scene.
Blood and DNA proved Fagan was at the scene. Gait analysis proved he had tried to cover his tracks with a complicated alibi. Police believed it was a robbery that went horribly wrong, and they now had enough evidence to bring a prosecution. In September 2008, Fagan stood trial at the Old Bailey. He pleaded not guilty to murder. Kathy's sister, brother and father were also there.
I think the hardest thing was watching Fagan lying, but you just hope that Damien and his team have got it right.
They had. Fagan was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life. Damien stood with Kathy's family as they heard the verdict.
You build a relationship with the family, especially in a case like this, where you had contact with them over a long period, and you do become very close to the victims' families.
You form a real bond. He was our only link to Kath, to get the right result for us as well and make sure that the right person was brought to the courts.
Today's verdict will bring some closure in seeing that justice has been served. However, it won't bring our Catherine back. She lives in our hearts.
We got, I won't say justice, but we got the sentence that will give us the time to heal.
When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time: the expert witnesses.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd had the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, we reveal the forensic imaging expertise behind the eventual capture of Michael Hardacre, the Rochdale Ripper.
After terrorising this small mill town, with that life sentence, Rochdale could finally breathe a sigh of relief.
And we discover how translating slang exchanges between friends in an online chat revealed a chilling murder plot.
The facts of this case are just simply shocking. The police, they knew that if they were going to bring a prosecution, they had to get to the bottom of this conversation.
Forensic imaging is really important. When marks on a body are found, at first glance it may not show much. So it's very important that we zoom right in. This is all about the detail. I would find sometimes patterns that other people would miss.
Rochdale, summer of 2000. A retired school teacher is assaulted and killed on her way home from a night out.
The body of 65-year-old Eileen Jorchek was found in an alleyway just a few minutes from her home. The prosecution at Manchester Crown Court says she suffered an attack of horrifying brutality.
Crime journalist Ron K. Phillips covered the case as it developed into one of the biggest manhunts in UK history.
Eileen, she'd been to her local pub for a reunion, taking part in a pub quiz. She was going home, she was almost home, when she was approached from behind and grabbed from behind. I mean, it was horrific.
Eileen Jorchek's daughter Claire was 35 at the time and living in London with her husband.
It was about 3 o'clock in the morning. Got a knock on the door, wondering what it was, and it was 2 police officers to inform me that my mother had died. It was surreal, you know. Obviously, we were all rallying around my dad because he was in shock, and we were in shock.
Eileen was well known and well liked.
She'd been working as a teacher for a very long time, long before I was born. And so when she did retire, I think she was enjoying just having a social scene that she had lots of friends. News out of the blue, you just don't, well, you don't think it's going to happen to you, do you?
The violence of the attack on Eileen shocked not just her own community, but the whole country. It appeared to be random and with no motive.
The body of Eileen Yauchak was found just yards from her home in the Deep Bush area.
Has been described by police in Rochdale as one of the most brutal they've seen in details.
The detective who led this investigation, he actually said in his 21 years in the force, he had never seen such a level of violence.
The police are trying to reassure women in Rochdale.
You can't go off really on your own no more in Rochdale, it's not safe to do so.
It's happening on our doorstep, so it is quite frightening.
It was really becoming clear that the police had to catch this man, and they had to catch him quickly, because people in the area were beginning to become very, very frightened.
The police had few leads and turned to the public for help.
I mean, the police were appealing to everybody, and what they were saying to members of the public is that, look, we don't know who this is, but it could be someone you know. It could be a member of your family, a member of your community. Please consider every possibility.
While police trawled for witnesses, forensic scientists analysed crime scene evidence for usable traces of DNA left by Eileen's killer, but there was none. So they turned instead to other tiny traces of evidence.
They managed to get these tiny fibres, which was perfect, but only to a certain extent, because without a garment or without a suspect, there really wasn't much else they could do at that stage.
You are in limbo, you're just waiting. And I mean, the police were very good, kept us informed all the time, but I don't imagine they had too much information at the time. I just wanted to see the whole thing finished.
The police had no DNA and no suspects to match the fibres to, but a dangerous person was still at large. Detectives needed a new approach and turned to forensic imaging expert Derek Tremaine.
Forensic is all about the detail. I would find sometimes patterns that other people would miss. So it's very important to look at the very fine detail and zoom right in.
Derek's approach was to analyse Eileen's injuries for clues to whoever inflicted them.
This is the image of Eileen Yauchak showing the intradermal bruise to the left cheek. You can see here, there's angles running off, and then there's striations running across.
This type of injury is known as intradermal bruising, and it can offer Derek a surprising record of how the injury was caused.
Intradermal bruising is the most useful injury to work with because of the fine patterning it might show. The thing is, with deep bruising, the blood can track along in the lower layers, so what might be a small bruise can spread out. Whereas intradermal bruising can leave very fine detail. It's very important when you're looking at something to look at the intradermal.
The shape of one bruise in particular caught Derek's eye.
It is quite heavily patterned and it runs off at an angle. When I first saw this, I thought footwear mark.
From a simple crime scene photograph, Derek might have discovered a piece of evidence that would ultimately save lives.
If you push down on your skin and lift it, it goes white. Now, what happens when a shoe hits it on and off like that? That blood gets displaced out quickly. So you might get areas of blanching either side. If someone's alive, after a time, it will repair itself. But if someone's dead, the heart's not beating, and then it will stay there. I knew it was a footwear mark as soon as I saw it.
Derek was convinced he had found the killer's footprint, but without a shoe to compare it to, there was little more detectives could do. Then, there was another attack. This time, the sexual assault of a 19-year-old woman.
And this was just 1 mile away from where Eileen's body was discovered. There was enormous, enormous pressure for the police to solve this. I mean, the tension within a close-knit community like that was enormous.
The police and the Rochdale community were asking if the same man could be responsible. But this time, police had an all-important clue, DNA, that identified the attacker.
The forensics for those pointed to a petty burglar called Michael Hardacre. He'd only been released from prison 3 months before the attacks began, and he had a background in petty crime, burglaries, street robberies, but no sex offending.
Police arrested Hardacre. They knew he had committed one attack, and his DNA also linked him to another sexual assault. Could he also be responsible for the murder of Eileen? His footwear could hold the answer.
So detectives managed to get their hands on a pair of shoes which belonged to Michael Hardacre, and they sent those to Derek Tremaine for analysis.
Derek's forensic imaging experience was now crucial. Could he match the bruising to the tread of Hardacre's shoe?
We scanned it in on a flatbed scanner, and then I made them both the same size, and I cut away the rest of the shoe. Then I resized the weapon using the 2 scales. So I know if the 2 scales, millimetre scales, line up together, that those are then the same size. When I first received the shoes, I looked at them, and obviously, with my experience, I could pretty well see that that was going to match. But obviously, we have to make sure. With these, you can fade them in and out, so you can see how they correlate together. As soon as we overlaid it, you can see this angle and the bits between. I could see that there was a match. It was that shoe that made the mark.
It was the first piece of evidence linking Hardacre to Eileen's murder. That meant detectives could now reconsider the importance of the fibres they had found. Did they also link to Hardacre?
Now, Hardacre, his girlfriend had given this a fleece, and he went everywhere in this fleece. He loved it so much, apparently.
When forensic experts made a comparison between the fleece and the fibres found on Eileen, they confirmed an exact match. Other evidence was found linking Hardacre to a series of attacks across the city. In September 2001, Hardacre was put on trial for the murder of Eileen Jurczak. 4 counts of rape, 4 robberies, an indecent assault, and 1 count of causing grievous bodily harm.
So Derek Tremaine very cleverly was able to match the sole of that shoe that he had from Hardacre to the imprint that was found on Eileen's face, and that, combined with the fibre evidence, made a really strong case.
The man who murdered a retired schoolteacher and raped a number of women in Rochdale has been jailed for life today.
The jury found him guilty on all counts.
Hardacre's string of violent attacks over the summer of 2000 left his victims and their families struggling to deal with the impact of his crimes.
Once it started coming out what I'd done, I was horrified. I was feeling sorry for the other victims, because not only that, because they'd survived it. Obviously, we were pleased that they got someone, because I didn't want anyone like that walking around. If they don't get arrested, they're going to go around, carry on doing what they're doing.
The forensic imaging was crucial in this case because it then gave the link between Eileen and Michael Hardacre. It just shows the power of, you know, forensic evidence.
With that life sentence, Rochdale could finally breathe a sigh of relief. Finally, they could really sleep easy in their beds, knowing that the expert witnesses and the detectives have brought this to a very good conclusion.
We got our verdict. Well, it was like that. I think that was probably the first time I cried. Because I felt it at that point. Well, he weren't a nice person. Just, you know, to take him away. But I felt relieved.
The fascinating thing about language is how it constantly changes, both over time and between communities, and sometimes people, police, juries, courts can struggle to keep up.
London, 2008, and a young woman 6 months pregnant is assaulted on the banks of Regent's Canal. Crime journalist Chris Summers covered the case.
The facts of this case are just simply shocking, that somebody could do something so unspeakable. On the day in question, the 15-year-old girl, she was hit over the head, knocked into the water, and then her assailant tried to hold her under the water, trying to drown her. And it was only a passerby coming along and intervening and saving her that she wasn't killed. She was obviously taken to hospital. She was obviously deeply traumatized, but she did recover, and 3 months later, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy.
Her assailant was 19-year-old Kingsley Ogundele. He was identified by a witness who had interrupted the attack. Ogundele was arrested, but detectives suspected there was more to the case and started digging.
There was no sign of any robbery, you know, she wasn't asked for any money or anything like that. Was it mistaken identity? They ran through all the sort of obvious things and then began to wonder, you know, the fact that she was pregnant, you know, who was the father? You know, was that something to do with why she was attacked?
The baby's father was 19-year-old Brandon Jolie, an aspiring musician at college in Luton. Was he somehow involved? Detectives were suspicious of Jolie and conducted a search of his computer.
They studied it at length, and that's where they unearthed these MSN chats that he'd been having with his friend. MSN was phenomenally popular around this time. It was the Snapchat or WhatsApp of the age. There was around 330 million users worldwide.
The friend Jolie was chatting to over MSN was Kingsley Ogundele. It was clear from the messages they were talking about Jolie's pregnant girlfriend, but it wasn't clear what exactly they were saying.
The police knew that Brandon and Kingsley were cooking something up in these MSN messages, but what was difficult for them is that it was all written in street talk, young people's slang. So the police, they knew that if they were going to bring a prosecution, they had to get to the bottom of this conversation.
Detectives had a hunch they were onto something, but to understand what, they needed to understand the chat between Jolie and Ogundele. So they turned to a new and emerging field of expertise, forensic linguistics, led by expert witness Tim Grant at the University of Aston.
This chat log was carried out in what we would call back then multicultural London English. It's sometimes referred to as Britain Urban English. So it picks up features from Jamaican English, but it's not, as it's sometimes characterised, as Jamaican patois. There are other features of multicultural English in there as well.
Tim needed to interpret the urban English used in the MSN messages and show proof his interpretation was accurate.
The conversation was quite an ordinary conversation, and they were just passing time discussing the TV show they were watching. Brandon Jolie was in Luton and Ogundele was in London, and they were chatting away, discussing this, that and the other, and then Brandon Jolie brings up this problem about his girlfriend.
Brandon told Ogundele how his music career was about to take off and said he wasn't ready to be a father.
He was terrified for how that was going to affect him. He was on the verge of a very promising, music career. He was working with people like Wiley and Tinchy Strider. He was on the brink of something really big, and the pregnancy and how it would affect him, to him, it was crucial and it couldn't happen.
The conversation then appeared to take a sinister turn.
So what I've got here is this portion of chat, which starts with Ogundele making the proposal, the suggestion, what if I get Duffine to batter the baby out of her? And then you get the reply, you could do that, but that is even better.
Ogundele appears to suggest killing the baby before it was born. But to understand precisely what was being said, Tim needed to decipher what was meant by the words fiend and beta. He turned to dictionaries of slang compiled by respected linguists.
So on this page, we have the word fiend, meaning to be addicted to narcotics, and a couple of citations from 97 and 2001. So we have the word bait here. And I think the earliest citation of the word bait is from 1872, and the one that's most likely to apply in this case was an individual who's likely to get into trouble or face unwanted attention. So you can see how that extends to doing something that's bait. It's going to get you into trouble.
Ogundele was suggesting he could get a drug addict or fiend to carry out the attack. Jolie's reply that would be even better meant they would be sure to get caught. But what did Ogundele mean by his next suggestion? I'll get the fiend to duppy her den.
Some aspects of slang are very, very long-standing indeed, but when you're talking about street slangs associated with new immigration, perhaps they do move faster, and multicultural London English can be a version of that. Duppy in 2008-9 was a relatively new term in multicultural London English. The regular sources hadn't used it. It's an old word in Jamaican English. There's a Bob Marley song called The Duppy Conqueror, and a duppy in Jamaican culture, folklore, is a sort of slightly undead character. It's a ghost.
So if a duppy means a ghost in Jamaican English, Tim now had to work out what to duppy someone means.
It's used as a noun, a duppy. The conversational turn in the chat log was to duppy someone. So the instinct is, can this term duppy, is it moving, is it transforming to be used as a verb? To turn someone into a ghost? Is it a conspiracy to murder? But that's supposition.
Supposition doesn't stand up in court. Tim needed proof. So he examined the language of the musical subculture Brandon Jolie was part of, known as grime.
There's techniques you can use to collect the language, depending on how easy or hard the particular terms are to decipher, and we always go back to how it's deciphered in a particular community.
Forensic linguists are constantly monitoring how language is used, and they create and share databases of new words and their meanings.
So I collected a data set from Grime Music Forum, which created a language database of the right community at the time, and I searched for the use of duppy as a verb, and I found this great example of this MC. And what he was doing was he was being filmed by a colleague. He was having a good night, the crowd were going wild, and he shouts off to the person filming, "Pass me a lem and I'll duppy the crowd." And as he shouted at, he mimed shooting a gun at the crowd like that. A lem is a slang term for a gun, probably a submachine gun. And it gave some evidence that to duppy might mean to shoot or to harm or to kill someone. So this was one of the pieces of evidence that to duppy could be used as a verb, and that could be used as a verb meaning to harm, to possibly kill someone.
Tim now had evidence of Jolie and Ogundele conspiring to murder.
So there was an initial idea to get a drug addict, a fiend, to carry out the attack on the girl, but it was decided that that was too obvious, it was bait. And then this portion of the chat ends up with Ogundele saying, "We will do it then."
In December 2009, both men stood trial for conspiracy to murder. Chris Summers followed every detail of the case.
Jolie had asked the girlfriend to have an abortion, but she had said no. And at that point, he considered that he would have to terminate her and the baby. That was, two lives you were gonna take, was pretty shocking. But that was what he set out to do.
The account of the attack by the eyewitness was crucial evidence. But without Tim's forensic linguistic investigation, it would have been impossible to prove the conspiracy charge.
I don't just stand up and say, I've done my research. I show how the words are used in context in non-controversial text. And then you look at the text that's really important to the case, and then they can see that the same meaning is being used there. I explain to the jury that this is the word as it is used in context and allow them to draw their conclusions.
Tim's evidence was groundbreaking. It was one of the first times in the UK that an expert witness provided evidence to prove the definition of slang terms.
The forensic linguistics people in this case were quite crucial because they were the people who could decode the MSN chats, which were at the heart of the whole case.
Brandon Jolie was found guilty of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 14 years. Kingsley Ogundele, who had carried out the attack, was sentenced to 18 years.
Forensic linguistics, as being admissible, has grown over the last 20 years or so in the UK and around the world. We improve the delivery of justice through the analysis of language, and that's the objective we seek.